Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our January 2024 CARE webinar with Professor Penny Hay from Bath Spa University. I'd just like to quickly introduce myself as well. I'm Assistant Professor Rebecca Heaton, and I'm going to be chairing tonight's session, welcoming Penny. So I'd just like to, first of all, give you a bit of background knowledge about Penny and just welcome her properly. So Professor Penny Hay is a Professor of Imagination from Bath Spa University, and she has a vast experience of teaching, research and community work, championing creativity and the arts in education, and she engenders new futures for educational learning. Today, she's going to be speaking about two really important projects, Schools Without Walls and Forest of the Imagination, which actually help envision new approaches to learning in, with and through the arts. Penny also has a lovely connection with Andrew Grant, who some of you may be familiar with, who actually was the architectural director behind these super trees, which are close to our hearts at Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. And together they champion intersects between conservation, nature, the arts and creativity in educational and living pursuits. So I'm really excited today to hear more about Penny's projects and her imaginative and creative ideas and kind of futures for education, creativity and the arts. And so as we've mentioned, the format for today's session is very much going to be Professor Penny Hay presenting to us, and then we'll engage in a little bit of a dialogue session and share some films with you. And there's an opportunity for you to ask questions throughout during the chat box. And then we can come back to some of those questions towards the end of the session. So thank you very much for joining us today from wherever in the world you are coming from. I hope you enjoy today's session. And I will pass over to Dr. Hay.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you for inviting me. It's delightful to be here. We have bright sunshine. It's 11 in the morning, so hopefully I can share some with you. I'm also really happy to see your faces when you're ready, but maybe during my presentation, that's not necessarily. So yes, thank you. Lovely introduction. It is a bit Harry Potter to be called Professor of Imagination, but hopefully I think we hope together, and all of the work I do with Andrew Grant and many creative professionals across the world, we're trying to kind of make creativity visible, make imagination visible, to help us understand it better. So I put together a presentation that, as Rebecca said, really focuses on learning everywhere. So our signature projects are School Without Walls, which is in its kind of 14th year, and Forest of Imagination, and we're in our 11th year with that. In fact, I'd met Andrew Grant when he just designed the super trees in Singapore with his wonderful team, Grant Associates in Bath. So let me share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to kind of make this almost like a kind of creative invitation to think differently about learning and think about your own context for what you're doing at the moment, but also what we can do together to reimagine education that really puts inquiry, creativity, imagination, the arts, and particularly nature at the heart of all of our learning. I have a tiny bit of static. I'm sure I'll get through that. So I'm a big fan of Bob and Roberta Smith's work. So he's an English artist who really is kind of fighting to save the arts in our schools. So his mantra, art is your human right, and all schools should be art schools. And I think when I talk about the concept of art, I'm meaning all of the arts, all of the time, everywhere, for every child and young person, well, actually for all of us, to think about how they are so important in our lives. My own specialism was that I trained in fine art and education, and I taught in the Southwest and in Glasgow. And the reason I'm showing this image, because I specialised quite early on in working alongside children and young people who didn't really want to go to school, who were either disaffected from the curriculum or from the rigid structures. And I put this in because this is Mikey Please's, I won't show the film, but you can have a look. He did the Vimeo for Bake Off, and he was a very creative child who just wanted to make films. And that's what he's made his career doing. So he won a BAFTA. He designed the Vimeo for Bake Off, and his pathway was through art college and then the Royal College of Art. So I was lucky. After I left Glasgow, I worked in London for nearly 10 years, and I was really fortunate to work alongside amazing artists like Sheila Berman and Yinka Shonabare, but also co-designing arts education invitations across the city with the Institute of Education, where I was first, and then Goldsmiths University. And in the last 2 years I was in London, I worked at Tate Modern, co-designing the learning policy with the head of education and interpretation, Toby Jackson, and just inviting children from local schools into the Tate, which was a space for experimental inquiry. So I would say, and by the way, without the public at this point, so just the idea that we are co-designing these, what I like to call experimental sites of, well, hopefully pedagogical innovation. So inviting children into the Yayoi Kusama exhibition, but then to explore concepts around infinity. And actually this became not just an art lesson, but a maths lesson as well, a lesson of life. And I was very inspired when I came back to Bath in 2000, just as Tate Modern opened. I was then very, very interested in the practice and the pedagogy in Reggio Emilia in Italy. So I spent, I have spent several years toing and froing from Reggio Emilia, and the practice there where they really respecting children's creativity from the moment of birth. So just the fascination of a child following their fascinations of their own shadow across the playground, but also really in dialogue with contemporary artists. So back in Bristol, there was an exhibition of Christian Boltanski's work, and thinking about the shared space of that philosophical inquiry that was so important. So as Andrew Bruton said, art isn't a subject to hide behind. Art is in the world. And so we set up the charity that was called 5 by 5 because it was 5 artists, 5 galleries to start with, working with 5 schools, but then in the legacy of Sir Ken Robinson's work, we renamed our charity House for Imagination. So here on the left, the philosophical inquiry, if you like, these environments of encounter. These are 3- and 4-year-olds, and one of them had said, how can we bring the outside inside? And on the right-hand side, the conversation about how big does a map have to be inside it. So these kind of provocations, these creative provocations from the children's minds and ideas and voices to invite then a co-constructed learning environment. And I think that's why, I'm completely passionate about contemporary art practice for that reason, because we have that space of dialogue to explore really complex ideas about being human and making sense, making meaning. So here's the lovely Sir Ken. I was so devastated when he died in 2020. He was a dear friend. I'd worked with him all the way through my time in London. And then he came to our university a couple of years before he passed, and we co-designed a marble run on our beautiful media wall with children who they're, in our context, year 4, so 8- and 9-year-olds, and working alongside our professors and our students as well. but also setting up these houses of imagination across the city and across the environment. So taking children to the art school to see the art degree show. On the top right, my initial teacher education students who are now teachers in a local primary school. So taking over a gallery to explore ideas. On the bottom right, we papered a gallery with dotty paper and explored it as a maths lesson. We co-designed a novel with David Armand, the author, and really inviting children into that space of inquiry. So the bottom left, the children there who are older, they're in a secondary school, so that's 11 and 12-year-olds in conversation with students across the world in Rwanda and Serbia and Spain and Rislington near Bath in the UK, asking those questions. What is education? What is learning? What is school? So I spent 5 years working in the same school, at the same primary school, to work the same children over 5 years to then document their learning as part of my PhD. And it was really about, well, what does a creative school look like? Bringing artists in here, Richard Long, the top right, Roger's teaching the steel pans. We've got workshops with parents and carers. And I ran a workshop every week for 5 years, every Wednesday, which was called Being an Artist, inviting children to think about their own identity as artists. So I documented all their learning and then followed their fascinations, followed their inquiries. So there was no prescription for what they had to learn. It was all about invitation and inspiration. So this particular child, Bo, not her real name, she was really fascinated in pattern and landscape. And then Jay, again, not his real name, he was also fairly obsessed with mountains and monsters. So as you would support a student in an art school, the same way with these children, thinking about how we then document all of their learning. So I can talk about my book later, but it's called, of course, it's called Children Are Artists. So that kind of conversation about schooling and about education and learning and the arts, the power of the arts in our lives, all of our lives, led to an invitation from Kate Cross, the director of The Egg in the pink skirt there, saying, well, we were talking around a kitchen table where all the best ideas come, I think, what about if we don't go to school? Where would learning be? And so the conversation around learning everywhere. And Kate said, well, why don't we do School at the Egg? So that gave birth to School Without Walls, which is an inquiry-based approach to learning where we co-design all the learning with artists, creative professionals, cultural partners, the Egg Theatre, which is designated theatre in Bath for children, and also local museums and galleries, parks and fields and forests. So also integrated, so it's a community of practice, and my student teachers there on the left also involved in the co-inquiry. So learning is everywhere, and the city is a campus for learning. So children are outside and inside, in the cafe, in the studio. Everybody has a reflective journal, which then documents all of their learning. And the learning inspired by the practice in Reggio Emilia is in 100 languages. So expressing their ideas in many different modalities and working alongside, in this case, a theatre group, but trying out those ideas back up in the studio where they can really think about that kind of transdisciplinary space for learning, where the arts are so important. So this theatre group would use puppetry and projection and music and dance and their bodies and so on, and teaching the children, professional processes and practices, so like filmmaking, that they could then really take back into their work, and sometimes individually and sometimes collaboratively. So every child had a reflective journal. So here's Tamara's first visit to the Egg, where she's celebrating the red velvet seats through collage, and then other children who have been to see a play by the amazing Toby Thompson, who actually was teaching my students only yesterday. We've worked with Toby since he was 3, and the idea that, you know, I wish I was a mountain. How do you document that story? How do you talk about more existential ideas? And in the English education system, we have the Office for Standards in Education. You probably have heard about Ofsted. And so here, the Ofsted inspector on the left, the children had been co-designing an activity all about coordinates, finding each other. They dressed up as spies, and then in the groups, they found each other around the city using maps. Interestingly, when the Ofsted inspector arrived, I thought she was dressed up with a trench coat on purpose, but there's another story there. And taking the children out into the forest, into the woods, but also into places of worship, into the shopping centre, into everyday life spaces, so that their concept of learning could be explored together. And wherever we were, the arts played a really strong part in that. So taking the children to the art school and trying out some of the processes together with our lecturers and technicians, and then really thinking when the students' degree show was on to then be in conversation with the students, and then they became role models. So I think it's really important that we make these processes visible. So taking over a meanwhile space in the city, we were able to take over an empty shop and reimagine it as an exhibition space for the children to share their learning with their parents and carers. Really important to keep that conversation going so that everybody feels part of the process. And also thinking carefully about the city. You know, Bath is a beautiful city, which Andrew's phrase, he talks about Bath as a landscape city, and it's a city of imagination. So the children were in their sketchbooks making drawings of the blue and green of the city and curating the space, so they came up with a collaborative mural together. And also thinking about families and being in conversation, in this case with families in Bristol, where we were playing alongside their 2- and 3-year-olds before they went to school. So thinking about how can we celebrate the sense of place, but also think about our role as adults alongside children, and what role does the artist play in that? How can we learn from the habits of mind of artists to be playful alongside children and young people? So we co-designed the concept of Bath Cultural Education Partnership together with the Egg Theatre, and really the vision is around shining a light on the creativity of the region, but also to break down the barriers between schools and cultural partners, hence the title School Without Walls. And together we've distilled 5 themes that we are attending to through all of our work, not just with School Without Walls, but Forest of Imagination as well. So really thinking about every child and artist, every child to flourish, the importance of creativity and imagination, nature and the environment, especially mental health and well-being, especially at the moment in response to the pandemic, but also the ecological emergency and the wars. And I think it's really important that the kind of reimagining of the education system really puts creativity and imagination, but also compassion and care right at the heart. I think Ken had 10 C's. So this is in well, many of you aren't in Singapore now, but some of you in Singapore now, obviously the celebrated super trees in Gardens by the Bay. So as I said, Andrew and I have worked together for about, well, probably 13, 14 years now, but thinking about taking over spaces in the city to reimagine them, to put creativity and imagination on the pavement, as Andrew would say. So why not call it Forest of Imagination? So together with our art and design students on the bottom left and my education students on the right, co-designing activities to then invite families, local schools, colleges, our university students and staff, alongside local and international artists, to work together to have a conversation about the importance of nature and our connection to nature, but also our collective imagination. So each year we take over a familiar space. So the celebrated Bath Abbey, an iconic building in our city, where the theme this particular year was 2016, was Andrew's work, which is really about one strand about saving the baobabs and the lemurs, the blue-eyed black lemurs in Madagascar, and then inviting children to explore a den that was finding the lemurs. And on the right, children, young people working with local artists to then think about, you know, if you were a tree, what would you be? How would that manifest if you were to co-design a sculpture together? So here's artist Helen Lawrence working alongside young people. And Andrew actually has now a research centre in Madagascar with Fields and Clegg Bradley Studios, where they are and Bristol Zoo, where they're researching the importance of baobabs and lemurs. And working, as I said, alongside Fields and Clegg Bradley Studios architects. So inviting the young architects to work with our local schools and families, and then co-design pop-up houses of imagination. And in this case, it was in a beautiful meadow next to the other university in Bath, University of Bath, where this is a cocoonery responding to the children's ideas that they'd developed previously with the architecture students, but also to then see that be realised together so they could play in them. And that is now a play structure in a local school. And in 2018, we took over the space by the river and in the central space called Kingsmead Square, and co-designed the whole event with Three Ways Special School, which is a special school with children and young people 3 to 19 with multiple and complex needs. Brilliant school. And together there was one child who was in a wheelchair, so everything was designed for her. She could only blink, and so it was all about universal access. And so everybody then came to play in the forest of 1,000 trees in the cardboard maze. My design students designed these drawing machines, and Andrew designed a pop-up performance space for the dancers to invite the children in, so it was fully accessible to wheelchairs. And then in 2019, we had a 10,000 people over 5 days at the Holborn Museum of Bath. In fact, we're back there this year. And again, workshops, a pop-up House of Imagination pavilion made of eco-ply. We had workshops with Norwest Media Centre on the importance of food in our lives. Everything creative and everything invitational, nothing prescriptive. So have a look at this film. It'll summarize our approach.
A scalable Christmas tree for public spaces made up of smaller potted trees that are then planted after the holiday, taking a familiar form and filling it with new meaning. Together with Forest of Imagination and students from Bath School of Design, we've been using Imagine If as a tool for playful design thinking and how we could bring life to the living tree year-round. We met in a virtual forest to share our ideas. That's wonderful. You want to pass it on to someone else to share?
Yeah, I'll pass it on to Maggie. Imagine if we could create a space in Bath.
Imagine if the tree could change its shape and its structure.
Imagine if there was the most incredible sensory, real and imagined space that drew on all of the senses and also brought in some sensory tech, so you were in an immersive environment where you could feel the raindrops.
And we developed these ideas further using new, creative, and collaborative online spaces.
And getting people emotionally invested. And almost like if you created an installation at home with your kids or as a family, sponsor like a section of the tree, a community project.
Imagine if a Christmas tree wasn't just for Christmas, but for spring, summer, autumn, and winter. Up all year round. Imagine if it was a habitat for local wildlife and insects, growing native wildflowers and plants, attracting bees and butterflies.
So that artist is now working with us. I met him in Denmark in 2018-19, and we've worked together ever since. His name's Andrew Amundsen, and he works with Wim Wenders, and he's Berlin based. He works with Wim Wenders and also with Alethea Eliasson's studio. So during the pandemic, the Egg Theatre was empty, and Kate rang me up and said, "Help, Penny, I've got an empty theatre, what can we do?" So I said, well, why don't we just bring a forest inside, which is what we did. So we co-designed the whole event, and you probably heard that co-design, co-production is really important to us. So we designed this beautiful living tree from sustainable materials. We borrowed a forest from a local architect, and these orbs are 100 orbs that are responsive to sounds and light. So they sing the songs of the forest, the canopy, the mycelium network underneath, the bird song. And we worked alongside Roxana Vilk and Squid Soup, Roxana is a British Iranian artist working alongside us in Bristol and Bath, and in inviting local schools in to visit this invitation for beautiful learning. We talk about, I mean, I was very inspired by Joseph Beuys's work, you know, every classroom should be a work of art. So over the period of 3 weeks, schools visited and explored big concepts around placemaking, map making, forests, environmental education. And all of the learning was sensorial and immersive and aesthetic. And that's really important, that for me, that we make visible those processes. So here the brilliant Lucy Cassidy co-designed a space at the top of the Egg Theatre in the studio, where she invited children into the Society for the Protection of Magical Creatures, where the children and families adopted a creature, of course, in their imagination, and then developed a care package for these creatures. So a kind of beautiful way to address key issues like climate change. You know, how can we think on behalf of our planet and the more than human world? So it was such a successful event that Kate invited us back the following year, and we teamed up with dear friend and colleague Professor Alf Coles at the University of Bristol, and co-designed not only a living tree but also a mirror maze, so taking the Shakespearean kind of metaphor of holding a mirror up to nature. And then the pandemic was softening, and although I know it's still around, but just the idea that, you know, we were outside and learning everywhere, taking sustainable materials up to the American Museum and co-designing the whole 2-month event, in this case with our design students. So all about inquiry-based learning. Out of that time, because we were in our studies and thinking about nature and how the importance of nature in all of our lives, we worked with the BBC, Creative R&D, and now Rabbit Holes Collective is a thing. It's about co-designing adaptive podcasts with young people to invite them to metaphorically fall down a rabbit hole and connect more deeply to the natural world. So I can share links to that after the session. And then this last year, just the last few slides before we open up for questions, we were invited into the Bath assembly rooms, so a Georgian building 250 years old that was designed in response to the pleasure gardens at the time. So it was an empty space, a meanwhile space that the National Trust had taken over. So to invite everybody, the whole community, alongside the natural world, to celebrate our creativity, but also our deep respect for nature. So Morag Myerscough, who you may know her work, inviting the community to think on behalf of nature and think about how we can protect our planet. So her installation was called Birdsong, and it was an immersive, beautiful sensory forest with lavender and lemongrass, but also walking through into the assembly rooms as an invitation to participate. Andrew Amundsen, with his brother Nathan, designed a beautiful provocation around how can we fill the traditional Georgian ballroom, which was used for all the balls and dances and card games and so on. how can we fill it with grasses to remind ourselves about our connection to nature, that we are nature? So the provocation came to life through a beautiful 1,000 grasses brought with the trust of the National Trust to respond to the space. And then Andrew Grant and his team with Piers Taylor and Charlie Brentnell designed the most gorgeous beaver's den, which, you know, was larger than life, but very messy in the spirit of beavers, with an invitation for the children to explore kind of beavery kind of ways of being. Fantastic installation. So I'm just going to end by showing the last film, and Rebecca, just check the sound on this maybe.
Where are we? What is the time? How far have we wandered? And who will finish our rhymes?
There is this feeling, it's like a rhythm, almost like a piece of music or something that has been put together. So mine is the hurrah as you come in.
How do we represent nature? I mean, there's so many things you could talk about. A story about Bath and its ecology, a story about design and the tension between formality and informality, referencing, you know, nature.
Assembled in the Forests this year as an invitation to the whole community to really think about coming together to explore these important themes around nature, imagination and well-being.
So something that is in your head when you go in, you don't have to know what it means. You just have to go in and wonder.
I mean, it's all layered and it's really hard to explain.
When you come into the room, you just feel in a new place. You know, it's nothing that you would have expected walking into the room. So it's nature out of context.
The messy, beavery world, because they create a mess, basically, beavers, to a large extent. But that mess creates really vibrant habitats for many other species.
You have to get down, you have to crawl, and that's what makes it interesting. Then you're transported into another, like, underworld.
What's our relationship to nature? How does it work in terms of the way we design and create places? You know, we've got that amazing dialogue going on here.
People always think because you have colour, it's for children. I mean, it is just for people, and absolutely for every age.
You come in and you have a new horizon line, you have a new perspective on things.
This wonderful opportunity to contrast this absolutely exquisite crystal symmetrical chandelier with something that's wilder.
This represents a 250-year-old beech tree. What we're doing is honoring the life and the time of this tree, which matches the 250 years of the assembly rooms.
What I'd like is people think about their own relationship with nature, and, you know, even in a little way, even on a terrace, even on a balcony, you can have that beautiful joy. The bees can come to you if you just you make the effort and put the flowers out there and, you know, the things that they like.
Amazing input from lots of people. An incredible sort of generosity, really, across multiple organisations and individuals to pull it together.
The creative community that comes together to make it happen every year is really special. And you do it because you get to see the schools come in, you get to see the families come in, and you get to see them be transported. And that's a beautiful thing. And it's about the imagination. It's how do you get people thinking differently.
So yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly well organised way of doing something, and unusual. And so at first it's quite hard to navigate because there's lots of different things going on, and you're like, is this all gonna, you know? And then when it comes together, you think, wow, that was genius.
We are all connected to the nature. That it's in our DNA. We share this, and when we're in nature, even if we're inside with this nature, there is a connection.
So I will end on this beautiful quote from Ursula Le Guin that you may know, that it's one of my mantras. It is above all by the imagination that we achieve perception and compassion and hope. Thank you, everyone. I'm very happy to take questions from Rebecca or the floor or both.
Thank you so much, Penny. I think we can all see where you've got your title as Professor of Imagination from. You shared with us today such beautiful artwork, inspirations for the arts, and really sort of advocated, I think, for possibility thinking. I think Anna Kraft, Professor Anna Kraft, who used to work at Exeter University, I think she would be really proud of what you've kind of managed to achieve through the projects that you've shared with us, because it really does demonstrate a kind of love and passion and belief in investing in possibility, ideas for the future, being open to change in arts and education, and how these different fields come together. And something I particularly love is the inclusivity that you've put as kind of really central to your piece of work. You really kind of champion different people's voices, particularly children's voices. And you champion for difference as well. And everybody's ideas in the projects that you shared seem accepted, that there doesn't seem like there would ever be a no. Ideas are always open and fluid. So thank you so much for sharing such inspirational work with us today. So I have myself a couple of questions for you, but I'm sure there are people in the chat who would also like to ask some things. So I'm just going to start off really kind of bringing us back to the Singapore context. So inquiry-based learning is quite central to art education, pedagogy and curriculum design here in Singapore. So in both of your projects, School Without Walls and Forest of the Imagination, how do you think that you've used, or can you give us some examples of how you've responded to social developments or injustices to really kind of help young people understand these?
Yes, good question. I think, you know, social justice, well, social and environmental justice, well, all the justices are really central to our work. So we work in this region, particularly, we're very committed to state education, so working alongside every child to give them access to a high quality arts education. So you saw in one of our slides, you know, every child an artist, every child to flourish. And the concept, for instance, of School Without Walls is that it's about active citizenship. So thinking together, being together, making together, and thinking about how we can be active in our citizenship to think about the community as well. So there's a lovely phrase from Professor Scott Bolt where he talks about, you know, the child is actually the curriculum, and then the community is the school. So if learning then is everywhere and everybody's sharing ideas for how we can have more inquiry-based learning together, responding to social action. And I think that one of the things we've done with our university, because we work alongside local schools and obviously our students and staff, but you know, we've turned our university into more of a social enterprise. So in response to the local community and working with the community to think about how we can, you know, make the world better.
That's lovely, thank you. And I really like what you said there about, in a way, kind of flipping things around, like the child becoming the curriculum, the community becoming the learning. I think they're really kind of lovely ideas to kind of help us begin to kind of rethink perhaps we can do education differently, particularly using the arts as a support to do that. And I think that links really nicely actually to the question that Chiam Jali has asked in the chat. So this person has asked, how do you go about framing the questions that are posted to children to make it inquiry based?
That's a very good question, and I really like your butterfly. So I think it's it comes back to what you just said, Rebecca, because I don't know whether you know, but Professor Anna Kraft was my PhD supervisor.
Oh, no. Okay.
I worked with, I mean, sadly, Anna died from cancer in 2014, but working on the idea of invitation for learning and possibility thinking, valuing the space of uncertainty. So the ideas and the questions, the inquiries come from the children themselves. Of course, we're holding that space of, you know, a community of practice, a community of learners. So in the Egg Theatre, we would obviously have a reflective session with children to really think about their interests and what they would like to pursue. So then that became the starting point for how we designed their learning and their curriculum. They still had, because in the English context, we have a national curriculum. Not all schools have to follow it if they're private or academies, but we still have curriculum coverage. So children still learning, you know, as Ken said, numeracy and literacy are as important as the arts, but creativity is in everything. And I think if we're starting with questions, if we're starting with inquiries, and we can pursue these inquiries together, then everybody then becomes a learner, and everybody, as Rebecca said, you know, everybody's ideas are valued. That's so important to us, is a respectful, creative environment for learning.
Thank you, Penny. And as a kind of follow-up to that, in the chat, there's a kind of second part to that question. Are there any particular materials that you would refer educators to kind of carry out some of these ideas themselves? Like who are your go-to people that you would encourage others to look at?
So in terms of theorists, Rebecca?
I think theorists, or just kind of supportive materials for teacher educators or artist educators.
Absolutely. So, gosh, how long have you got? I could send a list of recommended resources if that helps. But certainly thinking about the space of inquiry and possibility thinking, then Vlad Glavenou, who I'm working with at Dublin City University, he's written extensively on the concept of wonder and creativity and possibility thinking. In fact, if you're free, it'll probably be the middle of the night for you, but he is giving a session later on today and again on Monday, actually, around pedagogies of possibility. So tonight's session is on wonder and Monday's is on pedagogies of possibility. I can send you those links. But I think, you know, all of Anna Craft's work, when she died, we put together a beautiful book, which I happen to have on my desk because I was teaching my art specialist yesterday. And just the idea that, you know, we think about the role of creativity and education in society. So Anna Craft's work, obviously, the work that we're doing in an English context, Arts Council England have got a space, a digital space called Creativity Exchange. So I've got an article on that, all about School Without Walls. And also, again, in London, but it's affiliated to the Institute of Education, the Helen Hamlin Centre for Pedagogy has a really rich space of resources. And then in England, again, the Chartered College is looking at rewriting the curriculum. So we've got lots of seminars coming up about experiential learning. But I think internationally, you know, there's so much good practice across. I know in your own institution, I think it's fantastic that you've got all of that approach and commitment to inquiry-based learning. And there are really good examples around the world of that. So I mentioned Reggio Emilia in Italy. In Finland, the approach to education, they're working with the organisation 100. In Harvard, Project Zero, and their kind of thinking palettes. I think there's so many resources that you can have a look at. I think particularly for my interest in ecological imagination and climate education, there's an organisation called Our Shared World, which is got a fab set of resources. I wrote a piece about Forest of Imagination for them, and how what we're trying to do is not only put the emphasis on imagination and nature, but also how we shine a light on the importance of global forests and biodiversity. I have some favourite theorists. So in terms of arts education, I'm still affiliated to the Centre for Arts Learning at Goldsmiths University in London, and they've got some amazing resources in their Ecologies of Practice, which is run by Miranda Matthews. And in fact, Andrew and I've got a chapter coming up in a book for them, which I can share with you, all about Forest of Imagination as an aesthetic imaginary. So I think that's quite a lot to be going on with.
Lovely, thank you for sharing those. And I think actually, if there's anyone here who's been thinking about doing a master's in art education here at NIE as well, we actually do look at quite a lot of the projects that you're mentioning, the Harvard Project Zero, for example. So if people want to find out more, then do think about the different routes on offer to kind of master's and PhD studies as well. Okay, thank you, Penny. So something that really kind of strikes me about your projects, you refer quite a lot to things like breaking down barriers and kind of empowering people and opening up the arts and education and bringing people together. So why do you feel perhaps now more than ever, why is it so important to have this role within the arts?
Yes, that's a very big question, but I think from my point of view and my experience of learning alongside not only my students at the university, but also local schools and the local and international artists that we're working with now all across the world, I think essentially in response to the kind of, if you like, existential crisis, you know, the pandemic, the ecological emergency, the wars, just the way we are living in the world now. Hence, that's the quote from Ursula Le Guin that I wanted to share, because I think the more we can profile the importance of compassion and community, you know, making community together, making sense together, communing together in learning, that really highlights the power of the arts, because there's a beautiful quote from Nora Bateson, actually. In fact, again, I seem to have the right books on my left by chance. But she's just written this book, which is absolutely fantastic, which is called Combining. And Nora talks about, you know, we're learning like a forest, we're learning like a meadow, like an ocean, and everything's connected. And then really thinking about the power of the arts in that process, because it allows children and people, but all of us, to express our ideas in different modalities in a transdisciplinary space, still respecting the integrity of each art form, but then really thinking about how we want to say something. And as I said, Andrew Brereton talks about, you know, making learning. We are making learning, we are making ourselves. And I think that comes back to my book, Children Are Artists, because it's about our own plural and developing and fluid identities. One of my artists said to me the other day, you know, well, the arts are permission to try out different versions of ourselves. And I think in terms of, it comes back to that notion of, you know, personal, social, cultural expression, and the need much more for mutual tolerance and respect.
Thank you. I think you're really kind of sharing a kind of ethos of care and nurture, which sort of leads into my next question as well. Why is nature so important to your projects?
Well, not just because of the biodiversity crisis. I think absolutely we need to start thinking about our place in the more than human world. And I think it, you know, one of the provocations I often invite our children and young people to do is to think on behalf of nature. So the provocation this year in the Forest of Imagination was, you know, if you were a tree, what would you be? So Andrew and I were on a podcast actually, and he chose a baobab, the strength and the kind of beauty of a baobab, but I chose a weeping willow, because to celebrate the kind of joy and grief and everything that is made up of life, and how then you're connected to the river. And I was talking about, you know, how we share our joy and how we share our grief in the spirit of thinking about the planet and how important nature is. So as Andrew talked about in the film, you know, the whole focus on biodiversity is actually the theme this year for Forest of Imagination back at the Holborn, and we're co-designing a ring of life to think about the million small acts we can make every day to make a difference. And we have an aligned project with the Royal Society of Arts called Playful Green Planet, with the Eden Project, the Forest Team, 100 in Finland, and our university, to think about playful pedagogies that celebrate our nature connection and how we can co-design those inquiry-based learning invitations, but alongside the community as well, to take over, well, to prioritise people who don't have access to nature and to bring nature back into their lives.
Thanks. And I think what you're saying is that there's sort of a kind of natural circulatory system sort of coming through all of the kind of design of your projects, as well as the kind of themes that are being explored. So I think it also kind of, for me, it also brings that connection back between the body and nature, and that kind of the way we kind of live circulating between culture, society, the arts, nature, care, nurture. They're all very kind of living processes. In the chat box, Elaine Eng has also asked if you could share a little bit more about your work in preparing educators to embrace this approach to inquiry, and particularly when they're working with children and honouring what the children actually offer. How do you give value to that?
Yes, that's a good question. And that was exactly our conversation yesterday with my art specialist. So in the English context, I teach intending teachers, student teachers, who will be then, they've all got degrees in different art forms. So psychology, the arts, education, a wide variety of degrees. And then for a year, we work with them to train them to be teachers, and then they'll take up a place this September. And I think our constant conversations are about not only the values that underpin why we do what we do, and the importance of experiential learning, inquiry-based learning, the power of the arts in learning, but also across the curriculum, so learning in, about and through art. And then thinking about how we pay attention to the dispositions of learning, the habits of mind to do with creativity and imagination and making connections and thinking through ideas. And I think that's where they can really observe children that are in their care and really think about their interests and their passions to weave those ideas into a curriculum provision. So I think in the end, you know, one of the things that I invite my students to do is to think about what is a beautiful classroom. You know, how can we invite everybody to every classroom to be a work of art? How can we invite every child to take part in that process, so that intrinsic motivation is really important, and the creative learning environment itself, whether that's inside or outside, is really vital. And also the attention that the students are paying to each of the art forms, and going beyond that in terms of, you know, how exploration of different art forms and bringing those together allows us to pursue inquiries across the curriculum. So yes, it's a fantastic ongoing conversation about kind of pedagogical innovation and how we can respond to, say, for instance, a structure like the national curriculum, but how we then move in the spaces in between, and that the learning environment for the children is inclusive.
Thank you. And I think you made a kind of really lovely sentiment there about kind of arts and classrooms kind of not having these walls or barriers, and being kind of very kind of open spaces and artworks in themselves. So it's lovely to hear somebody talking that way about the importance of the arts. And I think really with that in mind, within these kind of creative pedagogic kind of learning spaces, just linking back to what Chianjali asked in the chat, how would you think about assessment in those spaces? Again, like if people are brave enough and they do take the risks to kind of advocate for learning in this way and try new things out, how would they then perhaps meet more formal assessment criteria?
Yes, that's a good question. We've been really thinking about that with our colleagues at the university. We have an experimental space for thinking about multimodal assessment that's been embedded not only in the processes with Forest of Imagination and School Without Walls, but also thinking about our students' assessments at the university. So for instance, my art students, they submit a reflective journal and a portfolio, but they can choose which pathways they use to express. They can make a short film, they can write an anthology of poems, they can make an exhibition, etc. And I think that integration of assessment, so it's not just summative, that it's formative, that it's ongoing and negotiated and responds to the student voice, whether that's in school or in college or university. And that idea that everybody's part of that process and opening up that space of dialogue again, so that people can see their own journey, they can see their own progress over the time. And I think that's what comes back to, you know, learning being artful and full of possibility, but then the attention, we talk about the importance of the time, the space and the attention that you pay to the ideas, but also the quality of dialogue in there, so that the learning is ongoing and constant.
Thank you. And I really love some points you picked up there about time and space, and particularly one that really hit home for me was about the notion of choice, giving our learners choice in our approaches to assessment. Can they respond to us through the arts in different ways, and are we open perhaps as educators to giving them that choice and assessing where that choice is actually valued? And so I think that's definitely things for lots of us to think about how can we develop our assessment processes, particularly perhaps within arts education and beyond, to give students more choice, which in turn will help value their voices. So thank you for sharing those lovely ideas. Okay, I just want to give people an opportunity. I'm very aware that I've been speaking a lot, and obviously Penny as well. So I'm just wondering, is there anyone who wanted to unmute their microphone and perhaps ask Penny a question?
Please put your cameras on.
No, everybody's very tired after long days at work and being creative. Okay, so I really have just sort of one final question for you, really, to kind of close today's session. And it's been such a rich and engaging session with some fabulous ideas shared about how to develop kind of creative, innovative spaces for learning and kind of the future of learning and education and bringing the arts and collaborations together, which are all topics really close to my heart. But I think as a professor of imagination, just coming back to your Harry Potter title, which is so lovely, how would you like to see education systems evolve to support the imagination and the arts practices of young people for the future?
Yes, a very good question. Maybe that's the theme for the next seminar. But I do think that, you know, wherever we are in the world, I think we need to reimagine education to put creativity, imagination, nature, and well-being, the arts, right at the heart. So it's not just about a package learning that's prescriptive. It's about inviting inquiry. So I would put emphasis on the dispositions of learning, and for each learner to understand their own development as a learner and how they can pay attention to those processes, and to also value the space of uncertainty and not knowing, and thinking about how, I mean, the arts manifest that beautifully every day, but, you know, how ideas grow and develop and change, and how, as Nora says, you know, learning is transcontextual and in mutuality together.
And where would you like to go next then with your research projects? Do you have some ideas that you can share at this point? Or?
Yeah, so all of those values really underpin. So the work I'm doing with GLAD at the moment, GLAD Avenue, is around ecological imagination. So what I'd really like to do is to explore that space to then think about, as you suggested earlier from some of your questions, you know, how then we can do that on a daily basis. So it's not just about projects, that it's not just about an art project coming into a school and going again. It's a daily inquiry together in a system of relationships. So I think it is about systems thinking, and we do need a paradigm shift. So I think many of our projects across the world, we're working in Europe at the moment on the concept of the art of learning, teaching, research and education around arts and cultural expression, treacle, and also the idea of our work in India, which is all about the city as classroom, so a living lab, and inviting students, well, in the context in India, children who are living in informal housing, thinking about the ideas coming out of reimagining waste and making that learning purposeful in a making space. So lots of ideas for future imaginations, but in the context of England, we're thinking about currently thinking with the Cultural Learning Alliance about a new cultural education plan, and a recent project published by Sally Bacon with the Gulbenkian Foundation, The Arts in Schools. It's a really brilliant document that builds on Sir Ken Robinson's work from 1982. So yes, I think that it's never been more urgent to reimagine the education systems.
Thank you, and I think you can really see there as well how your work's kind of championing and building on the work of Ken Robinson as well. And I think kind of taking your passion for creativity internationally and just sharing there with us. There are so many possibilities of where different educators and artists and businesses and social enterprises, where all these different people can go with these projects, but right at the center of that is the arts, and how we can reimagine kind of new, changing, developing worlds using our arts and our love and passion for the arts and the care that comes from that to help us make kind of positive changes in the world. So thank you so much, Penny. You shared so many lovely things that there's many questions that I could ask you, and projects that I would like to question you more about, but I'm very aware that it's now 8 o'clock and people have come from school and from their work to come together today to kind of listen to this dialogue. So thank you very much to the audience for your really insightful questions. And I think if you do have other questions for Penny, then please do feel free to post anything into the chat. And we can, of course, share some of Penny's resources and ideas on our CARE website as well. And I'd just like to thank as well our behind the scenes team. We have Saul and Eunice, who very much support our admin side of things behind our Centre for Arts Research and Education. And so thank you everybody for coming together today to be part of that, and an extra thank you to Penny for such lovely sharing and inspirational ideas. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Lovely to meet everyone.